Well, my experience with Badfinger, it's not an extensive story. It's just unique to one of the quirky, unique parts of their story, which is I woke up one day or sometime in the news or somewhere, learned that Badfinger had suddenly moved to Milwaukee, which is as strange as it sounds. I started learning more and more about it, and then I heard that they were going to perform on the rock stage at Summerfest, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is Milwaukee created a lakefront music festival, multi-stage music festival back in the 60s, and it has grown to what is self-proclaimed and maybe in fact the world's largest music festival. It's an 11-day thing that happens every summer, and this enormous infrastructure has grown around that on the lakefront. Anyway, in the 80s, it was the premier musical experience every summer. And the 93 QFM rock stage was where the mid-level rock stars and every local band was desperate to play. And suddenly I found out that Badfinger was going to perform. And of course, I knew I had to be there. And I knew there was some level of connection and power because nobody gets on that stage after the festival has already started. And what makes my story a little bit more unique is that at that time I was managing the preeminent local band in Milwaukee. So I was part of the whole swirl of intrigue and the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, quite literally, at the time. And I knew that Milwaukee was particularly click operation as far as rock and roll goes. Either you're in or you're out. And I'll defer to a quick story that I think give you an idea of how much of a click Milwaukee was in terms of rock and roll. There were agents, local agents, who booked the local bands into the local clubs, and there were a lot of them. And if you weren't accepted by those agents, then you didn't play any of these clubs, no matter how small. Some of them were, playing on bar tops, and there were two bands who could not get into the click at all. And one of them was a band called the Violent Femmes. They were so downtrodden that they were playing out in front of the Oriental Theater for change. Literally, guitar case open. You can imagine them, playing, and they were playing outside the Oriental Theater the night the Pretenders were playing. Chrissy Hines saw them playing and invited them in to open the show. And that's how they ended up getting their record deal. They were rejected in Milwaukee and then ended up, well, we all know where they are now. So anyway, I did everything I could to get backstage at their performance because I wanted to meet the band, but not really for any other reason than I was a fan. And well, I didn't meet the band, but I did meet their manager, John Cass.
Yeah, at the time, John Cass was
At the
managing.
time.
Had you ever crossed paths with him before that in Milwaukee, out of curiosity? That was the first time.
No, no, I'd never heard. This is what was so fascinating and mysterious about this is the fact that they arrived and they were connected to some. I mean, they weren't part of the. You'd think the clique would have brought them in, the agents would have brought them in, the club owners, and you don't do anything in this town in Milwaukee if you're not in that group. So suddenly they arrived, and I thought that's weird. And then they were connected to this guy who nobody had ever heard of, which plays out in the tragedy of the story because he really didn't know what he was doing, and how he convinced them that he did is part of that history. But so I knew that they were out of sync, and it was obvious from the places that they were playing. There were strange one-off things that somebody who knew nothing was pulling some strings, knew somebody somewhere, and got them one-off things. And it was obvious they weren't going to go anywhere with that management. Anyway, I befriended John, and he invited me to his home in West Dallas to meet the band. And the band I was managing was managed by one of the major local talent agencies, and it was one that could book a band at that stature throughout the Midwest. And that seemed like something they needed. And so I presented that, and the band agreed that I should try to intrigue this agent into representing them.
Yeah.
I mean, all I knew is that they needed to be plugged in, and
Mhm.
I plugged them into John Gold, who owned a company called Talent Associates. So that was my one and only meeting, and I left going, well, I've done my thing, and they're on their way. Until I got a call from Mangold a week or so later saying I'm having trouble booking the band, and the clubs that he booked just trusted him to take over their clubs, book them whatever way he wanted because they respected his decisions. But he was saying he was getting feedback saying that, the band can this really be Badfinger? Is this really the original Badfinger? It's been 10 years. I've
Yep.
done all these things. And John said he was having trouble booking them and that he wanted an audition to prove that they were really who they said they were. And I just went, oh my God, these people have come down from the heavens, essentially, of rock and roll history. They're proteges of the Beatles. They're an Apple record band, and you want expecting these people to audition for you so that you can book them in the Midwest. But I knew that step had to be crossed, or they were back to John Cass trying to piece things together in a market that he doesn't have any leverage in. So I went to Graystar, the band I was managing, and they were going to be playing a major club in Milwaukee, which they did on a 4 times a year kind of thing. And I said, well, John, your agent wants to audition these people before he books them, and would you let the band audition for him before your show? In other words, not as an opening act, but literally during a sound check before the public came in. John Cass had been so ridiculously unprepared for this that he had brought the band in without equipment. So how is this band supposed to audition without equipment? So I had to find a situation where they had equipment. So I figured, well, they could step into the band's equipment, that Graystar's equipment, and do their thing. And the band reluctantly agreed. I was kind of miffed that they didn't have a respect for who Badfinger was. But anyway, so we put it together, and keep in mind, now you've got a band of English men in a strange town having to perform an audition without rehearsal on equipment they've never seen before. And as I mentioned in my story to you, the drummer for this band was so huge that he had the nickname, his fans nicknamed him Mudslide. I mean, he was a huge guy, and his drum kit was enormous. I think, is it Mike Gibbons is
Yeah. Mike
the
Gibbons is a
drummer?
very small
He's a
guy.
little guy. I mean, he's a wonderful, personable little guy, but he's literally little. He literally looked like a toddler trying to play on his dad's kit or something. I mean, he was literally swallowed up by this kid. Anyway, I'm outside the doors to this venue, and the public, Graystar had this huge regular following, so they were just all jammed up, ready to come in, and we were holding them back so that the audition could happen. So I heard the beginning of, I think it was No Matter What. You could tell right away it was Badfinger. And I'm just looking at the people around me going, you have no idea the history that's being made on the other side of this door. And then the music stopped. And I thought, oh no, this isn't going right. And I went in to watch it, and they started back up, and they played their hits. And it was, again, perfect. And of course, Mangle then realized that it reminds me of the classic line when Lennon at the end of the Beatles Apple rooftop concert said, "On behalf of the band, I hope we pass the audition." It was the exact same thing. I mean, and they passed the audition, and John went on to book them. But that was my entire experience. I mean, they went on. I don't know how long they stayed with Mangold, and then I learned of the tragedy, and I realized tragedy had come home. I mean, there was this brief moment where this wonderful energy was alive and well in my hometown. And now it led to this. There was subsequently a Milwaukee magazine article about the whole tragedy in detail. It didn't include this story, strangely enough, but I couldn't help thinking that the reason this second death occurred is that it had something to do with the Milwaukee experience, just putting things in such a tragic light that he saw no outcome to it. But I'm not here to interpret all that. You know the story, and your fans know the story, and so I really don't have much of a story other than it fills in just a few pieces of the puzzle. If you've ever put in a puzzle and you get to the end and there's a couple pieces missing, no matter how clear the picture looks, it just looks. And if it's the right piece of the lose track of what the picture is. And I think this was a critical issue. They just didn't get connected with the right people. Period. I mean, then and they suffered from it, and they were trusting. And they were forced to keep looking for options. In order to keep going, I guess.
Pivotal transition that you were sitting in, as you outlined, like between when they were managed by John Cass and when Jack Koshik would help them with a lot of the bookings in that area, right? And so understanding kind of how those dots were connected, I think, is a really important anecdote among all of it. And so many business encounters seem to get them on the wrong track and take advantage of them. But that's when I agree. I don't think they recovered from John Cass completely. You mentioned with Badfinger, there's kind of 2 points there. One is the clickiness of that market, which is interesting. I didn't have any of that context. The second part, the difficulty in booking a band that maybe hadn't been on Billboard in 10 years. And 1982, we're in new wave music. We're in a totally different era. And maybe, I want to talk about the Beatles reunion stuff in 79. Certain acts that had the following could always get an audience. But was it challenging to book these pseudo oldie acts kind of in the early 80s?
I think it was unique to Badfinger because I think the people that he was offering the band to wanted them to be Badfinger, but didn't believe they were. I have another side story with Joey Mullen, which is I was working with a club owner and an East Coast concert promoter, and we were exploring a prototype for a classic hits music show for PBS that would run in the vein of Austin City Limits, but it would be more classic hits. And we did a British Invasion prototype show that included Joey Mullen. And so I heard him perform. This was in the 2000s area, so it was substantially after that. And I was producing the show for the television part of it. So I was I interviewed all of the performers, and there was, leftover, I don't say leftover, but the remaining original members of a number of different bands. Mm-hmm. And so we were interviewing them one at a time about their history. And so I did interview Joey Mullen. It'd be interesting if I could find that footage. And that leads us toward other subjects.